It's March 29, 2019. The UK has just left the EU. Oliver is a farmer in Northern Ireland. As opposed to preparing his soil for harvest, he queues up at the Newry Jobs and Benefits Office. He struggles not knowing how he can provide for himself, now that 82% of his income has been cut because the Common Agricultural Policy is no more. He is one of 45,000 people in that same position. 45,000 people who work on farms whose income has been destroyed. Mary runs a small textile plant in Belfast. Previously, as 50% of Northern Irish imports and exports went to the EU tariff-free, she was able to run a successful business. She now knows her produce will remain sitting on shelves, unsold, gathering dust, and heavy tariffs from the EU come in, making her uncompetitive. Theresa May's promise of a good deal was a hopeful dream at best. Ladies and gentlemen, Brexit is an atomic bomb, and Northern Ireland sits at the centre of its blast. It truly means devastation for the EU and for the people of Northern Ireland. It's easy to talk about GDP in lofty terms, to talk about employment as just a statistic, but we forget it affects real people. When unemployment rises, more people die. It affects their lives, their livelihood, the basic pleasure they get out of it. It is incredibly important. This is not an academic discussion. This is a discussion that affects people. No, thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Mark Finn. I'm captaining Trinity's team tonight. What myself, Caoimhin and Ryan are going to do is a couple of things. We want to demonstrate to you there's a glimmer of hope. There is a way to avoid the devastation of Brexit, and that is why, come March 29th, we support a united Ireland. I'm going to set out our case tonight. I will highlight what we mean by supporting United Ireland post-Brexit, before examining how Brexit will devastate the Northern Irish economy with or without a hard deal Brexit. I will also outline why we believe that hard deal Brexit is more likely. Caoimhin, our resident Northern Irish speaker, will characterise the situation in the North probably more accurately than anyone can in this room, and explain why United Ireland is something that is possible, but also in a peaceful manner. Ryan will stand up and just be very angry. He'll summarise our case in depth, talk about why, even without Brexit, Northern Ireland would still be suited economically to United Ireland, and conclude our response to the opposition. We will engage with the opposition side all the while, and explain why we believe our arguments triumph. And we also hope that it's something enjoyable for the audience here and up above us here. So, what do we mean by supporting United Ireland? We believe that this is the best option, a crucial option for Northern Ireland. We'd imagine this happened via the mechanisms put in the Good Friday Agreement, a border poll. And aside from the multitude of benefits that our team is going to bring you in tonight's debate, I think there's something really important to note from the start. In a minute. Northern Ireland did not vote for Brexit. Northern Ireland, when polled after Brexit, supports United Ireland. This is what people want. We respect the will of the people. We respect self-determination. We think that people know what's best for them. And we think the people of Northern Ireland know what's best for them. We think that they are aware of the horrors of Brexit, and we only hope that after our speeches tonight, so too our British opposition. After all, they have to live with them. I'll take that point now.
All right, so at what point following March 29th are you envisaging the United Ireland?
I mean, we'd imagine that this is probably something that takes a while. We think that it would probably involve having to plan in terms of how this would happen. It would have to happen after a poll. We don't think the debate relies on the mechanism, however. We think this is a debate about supporting that as being something that's good. We think it's a debate... I'm answering one, no. No, sorry. We think that's something that is about supporting that United Ireland. We think that's something that is beneficial for the people of Northern Ireland. So the first argument we want to make in terms of the economic effects of Brexit on the North. We believe a hard deal Brexit is more likely and is worse for the North. We think that Theresa May promising that she'll deliver this magical deal that hasn't really materialised at all and that there's been no evidence of is about as likely as her saying she's a good dancer. So why is this the case? 4 reasons. Firstly, arguments don't work. Hopefully not tonight, in that case. Sense won't prevail. If sense prevailed, quite frankly, Brexit would not have happened in the first place. Despite months of explanation of its horror, despite all major parties opposing it, expert after expert on TV explaining why it was terrible, Brexit happened. Experts were ignored. The Tories don't care about the economic devastation that will come post-Brexit. It's happening anyway, whether it's a hard or soft deal. What they care about is what they will get them re-elected. That's pleasing an electorate who still has a huge disregard for the EU, something that is firmly established. Second reason, the Northern Irish backstop. The proposal of a backstop is a no deal for the UK. It would be an electoral catastrophe for May because it has been viewed as breaking up the Union, a mentality which voters despise. The attempts at a compromise of a UK-wide backstop lacks critical DUP support and lacks backing from most Tories. It's perceived, even by the softest of soft Brexiteers, as an unacceptable limit on the UK's sovereignty, as they'll still be in the customs union, and that temporary time limit on the backstop is something that they won't accept. The EU will never accept a backstop which the UK can remove at any point, and the UK will never accept one that the EU has total control over. Nor will the EU accept the UK being in the customs union without them paying their fair share, without them being a proper, fully fledged member. This deal that we hear some hope about is not a reality. The third reason. There's the mantra that it can be pulled out of the bag. It remains as something that exists. It's a mantra of UK exceptionalism, a mantra that we're fine on our own, that this Brexit, even when this Brexit vote happened and the dawning reality of what was happening set in, polls haven't changed. Polls conducted as late as last week still reflect the same numbers before the before the Brexit vote happened. The mentality hasn't changed. The same mentality that thinks that free travel is a bad idea, but thinks it's acceptable to be outraged when British holidaymakers cannot go to Spain and Portugal anymore without paying a tariff. It's a belief that there is going to be something that can be pulled out of the bag. It exists in the public, it exists in Westminster, and it's why they will never realise what the EU truly wants and why there won't be a deal. And finally, to quote from another musical about overthrowing British imperialism, no thanks, Hamilton. People in the room where it happened know what's going on. And the people in the room where it's happening, in the negotiators in Brussels, have told us repeatedly that a hard deal is more and more likely. Every group from Donald Tusk to PwC is currently advising the public, advising businesses that a hard deal is likely. Those experts are people who know what is best. They know the situation in those negotiations. And we haven't listened to experts enough in Brexit, so I think we should now. Yes.
So, given that literally 2 days ago, Theresa May said she was happy to negate the need for a backstop and provide soft checks on goods and services, why do any of your harms accrue?
I mean, even this kind of brings me on nicely to the next point, because we still think that is something that's likely. We think that that deal is still a reality that won't come true. But even if that is the case, we're still going to explain why it devastates the North and why that will still be better under United Ireland. So the UK will exist on a hard border. That's what happens in Northern Ireland. And the Chancellor has insisted that this will happen if there is no deal. Citizens in the North lose their right to travel freely into the Republic. It means that if you're in a border town and you need to access healthcare, you can't do that anymore. The ability to trade is gone, as tariffs have caused a devastating blow. Long border delays and bureaucracy mean that there's constant checks on borders, putting a strain on your business to be able to import and export goods. Devastation to Northern Ireland. Devastation to the lives and prosperity of people in Northern Ireland. There's a reason they didn't vote for this. There's a reason that every farming lobby in the North is currently scared and angry. There's a reason they're hoping against hope it doesn't happen. But to answer Imogen's point more thoroughly, even if this isn't true, even if by some miracle a soft deal Brexit can exist, this is still a terrible outcome. Why? Billions lost in the common agricultural policy, billions lost in fishery support, billions lost in job support, in social programmes, billions that allowed the poorest area of the UK to do that little bit better. Billions lost, meaning job losses, income losses, prosperity losses. And it's important to note that funding won't materialise somewhere else. Firstly, a hefty divorce bill means Westminster is going to be replacing the EU's funding in the North. But secondly, the North is a small voting bloc, small economic bloc. It doesn't hold enough sway. It isn't politically interesting enough for people to care about. What they care about more and what gets politicians elected is more prosperous areas of Britain. So what is the solution? A united Ireland. A united Ireland which allows the North to remain in the EU, which allows them to continue receiving that funding, to continue to have free trade. Currently, 51% of their imports and exports go towards the EU. That is what we get from them. We allow that prosperity to continue. Ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, the evidence is clear. A hard border looms, but even if it doesn't one way or another, Northern Ireland is devastated. Strength and stability have evaporated and time is up. Ladies and gentlemen, Ulster says no. No to economic gibberish, no to xenophobia, no to jingoism. The ticking doomsday clock gets closer to midnight and Northern Ireland stands in the centre. Brexit is not reserved for op-eds, parliamentary discussions or chamber discussions such as this. It's not a matter of jokes, it's a matter of lives. Life and death, hardship or poverty. The only hope is a united Ireland. The only glimmer is to have that Northern Ireland. This terror ends now. Vote for the proposition, vote for United Ireland, vote because you care about the people of Northern Ireland. Thank you.
I now call upon Xavier Redmond to oppose the motion.
Madam Speaker, a little over 2 years ago, the British people voted for a referendum on the basis of a wave of populist nationalism overcoming the interests of the most vulnerable people it would affect. They voted for a devil they did not know over one they did. and they buggered up their own country. The proposition proposes that we follow in that exact example, and we do the same thing. We say no. A bit of setup in this debate. Firstly, there are many people in this room, and indeed they may number among the opposition, that in principle would like to see a united Ireland. Our only claim in this debate is that not in this political moment, not just because of Brexit, and not in the foreseeable political future. We do not think we are ready for it. This debate about principles cannot take place in a vacuum. That is all we say on opposition. We support Northern Ireland remaining in the United Kingdom. A lot of what we hear from opening proposition is about what would happen to this border, a lot of assertions and speculation about what this deal would look like. We say a couple of things here. The first is to say that it is overwhelmingly likely that the UK will stay within the customs union because that is the deal which Theresa May literally announced 2 days ago, presumably before Mark wrote his speech. That is the agreement which has been made. No, thank you. Another plausible alternative, which is also fine for our side, is the sea border in the EU. That was the case from the 30s to the 50s. We think it can be the case again. But also note that I'm told that in debating, we get something called symmetrical fiat, which is if this proposition team get to assume that there will be the political support for the UK to let go of Northern Ireland, we get the same amount of political support to assume that Theresa May might change her mind about some other things. So if they get to say that Theresa May will change her mind about losing a quarter of the constituent countries of the United Kingdom, we might get to say that she's allowed to change her mind about losing a backstop there. The only assertion we get about why that deal would be bad from the first speaker from the proposition is that there is no political incentive to help Northern Ireland. Madam Speaker, Theresa May only holds government because of the support of the DUP. Her overwhelming incentive is to make sure that Brexit harms Northern Ireland as little as possible. That is why they got an extra £7 billion after the last election. That is why Theresa May's incentive is to make sure it doesn't hurt Northern Ireland too badly. So, in terms of structure, what are we going to talk about on opposition?
Xavier?
You know what? Sure.
Okay, so wouldn't you say that perhaps how the DUP perceives to be the interest of Northern Ireland could be divorced from the actual economic realities? Look at what they wanted was bizarre. They said absolutely no regulatory misalignment with the UK under any circumstances. That is not in the interest of the people of Northern Ireland. That is in the interest of the DUP's politics.
There are two separate arguments made there. One is that the DUP will not be able to attract enough funding from the UK. The other is that they will allocate it in bad ways which do not help people in Northern Ireland or are likely to overwhelmingly favour Protestants. The first point is true. They can get more funding from the UK because they empirically already have and because this Theresa May's overwhelming incentive to do that. But the second point, if you say that they will allocate that funding badly, I think you concede something about the Stormont Assembly which is far more helpful from our side of the debate than for yours, but it concedes that that Assembly cannot represent both groups at the same time. What are we going to do in this debate? Firstly, I'm going to talk about politics and about why this reunified constitution must be either anemic, oppressive, or inflammatory, or possibly all three at the same time. And secondly, why this causes a huge rise in violence, discrimination, and discord. Justin is going to go over all our heads and talk a lot more about economics. At that point, hopefully we've convinced you and we can all go to the bar early. If not, Imogen is also happy to say a few words. So, why will this constitution be broken? Madam Speaker, the hint in this debate as to what a constitution which aims to represent both Protestants and Catholics is the assembly which already exists, that is the Stormont Assembly. In some respects, it has been implemented badly, but in other respects, we would suggest that it is trying to do the impossible. Why is that impossible? The first thing is to say in this debate is that you need constitutional restraint mechanisms if you are to stop this new unified state from either being oppressive or from being, more importantly, perceived to be oppressive by Protestants and thereby not getting Protestant buy-in to that political system. That means you need constitutional defence mechanisms like already exist in the Stormont Assembly, things like a 2/3 majority for legislation which threatens one or the other group, things like being able to walk out and collapse the executive as happened last year. The first reason you need it is to prevent discrimination. That is in some respects deliberate discrimination which still takes place in Belfast. Catholics in Belfast apply for social housing at almost twice the rate of Protestants and they have to wait almost twice as long to get it. That is real discrimination which continues to happen and which means you have to regulate the political composition of this government to make sure it doesn't do that. The second thing is that funding allocation in a unified state creates bad political incentives because Northern Ireland already receives £10 billion a year from the UK and runs at a 33.3% deficit of their gross value added. That means you would need to make huge claims on the budget of this unified state, which you would need huge political capital to get when Protestants are a numerical minority and when people who live in Northern Ireland are a huge numerical minority under this system. They can't get that money. Secondly, even if this government doesn't need constitutional mechanisms such that it is not discriminatory, it needs them so that it can get buy-in from all the groups it needs to run. That means getting Protestants and people in Northern Ireland and unionists in Northern Ireland to vote to run for office. But it also means a buy-in in a more serious, mature way that means discussion about politics isn't just about things like flags and national anthems, it's about things like economic policy. Secondly, when you have, and let's assume that you have, those good constitutional defence mechanisms, why does that cause bad outcomes? The obvious example is the Stormont Assembly. The first thing is, if those constitutional defence mechanisms are to be useful, they have to be exercisable at the unilateral discretion of one of the groups and not the other. Because if you give Catholics a constitutional defence mechanism against Protestant oppression, but then they then have to ask the Protestants' permission to use it, it's not a real constitutional defence mechanism. That means that the incentive for either side is to overuse those constitutional defence mechanisms so as to get rid of legislation that they just don't particularly like, even when it doesn't threaten their very existence. That is exactly what happened in Northern Ireland. Games of one-upmanship that caused things like the Ulster Unionists to end up with something like the DUP. That is the political seesaw that led one Northern Irish MP to remark, if they elect an arse, we'll elect an arse right back. Secondly, you have to make those constitutional defence mechanisms exercisable over the most important bits of public policy. Things like where funding is allocated, things like how the police are told to do their jobs. Because the things which are most important are also the things which have the most potential to oppress people if they are misused. That is why there are currently that is why, as the Stormont Assembly lays dormant, there are no bills about domestic abuse, there are no bills about healthcare, there are no bills about police regulation. The third thing is, in order to provide those constitutional defence mechanisms, you need to set up a binary between Catholics and Protestants. That is why you only get full voting rights in the Stormont Assembly if you tick the box when you run for office as to whether or not you are Catholic or Protestant. That means it's so much harder for someone like Enda Kenny to stand up and say, I am Catholic and I happen to be the Taoiseach, but I'm not the Catholic Taoiseach. Stormont could have been done better, but in some respects we think it was trying to do the impossible. We think what this proposition do in the debate is they set up a debate where there is only one right answer. Another way to do that might be to invite an English university traditionally associated with colonialism to debate in favour of English colonialism, but you know, that's another issue. A brief word on violence. It is not our claim that the Troubles will return. We think that would be bombastic and it's very difficult to prove. What we do say is that physical peace in Northern Ireland is delicate and fragile, and we have only achieved it because of 20 years of delicate and complicated political compromise. The difficulty of asking yourself whether that would end after you get rid of the Good Friday Agreement and after you make that country ruled by a Catholic majority is the difficulty of asking yourself, like, is my house on fire 20 years after the fire brigade arrives, right? Because if we've only just managed to achieve that, it is difficult to see why it would not come back. The other thing is that there are specific provisions in the Good Friday Agreement which do prevent violence. Most obviously, that is the £2 billion of funding that the UK currently provides literally to prevent violence in Northern Ireland, is the fact that MI5 spends 15% of their time preventing loyalist paramilitary groups in Northern Ireland from killing people. That discrimination does exist in some respects. It could exist more. We don't want to bring it back. We don't support a reunified Ireland. We don't support the motion. Thanks very much.
I now call upon Justin Graham to oppose the motion.
Politics is complicated, but I think if we learned anything with the wave of populism that we've seen over the last couple of years, be it Brexit or Donald Trump, if you stand up and say, I don't understand politics and I'm going to do what I want, bad things happen. And I think this is something that's a problem across government's bench. because they're not engaging with the substance of the arguments we give them and kind of just getting up here and saying, Theresa May's bad, Ireland's great, we'll fix everything. So let's drill down into some more nuance, but before we do that, let's do a little bit of rebuttal. I want to note for you that pretty much every argument that we've gotten out of GovBench is dependent on a hard Brexit occurring, right? Xavier gets up here and gives you some reasons to think that's not potentially true, because Theresa May has recognized that a hard Brexit is a bad idea, has publicly said, and EU sources have said, that they are reaching an agreement on not having a hard Brexit, not having a hard border in Ireland. But most importantly, government doesn't engage with the analysis about debate land that Xavier gives you. For those of you who aren't competitive debaters, I do want to flag this importantly for you. No, thank you. Because this motion reads, this House would unite Ireland post-Brexit, not this House supports a united Ireland post-Brexit. That means that government needs to support actually uniting it, not just saying it's great in theory. And it means that they need to actually respect the preferences of people in Northern Ireland. Empirically right now, if you do opinion polling in Northern Ireland and you tell people what the costs of unifications are, 11% of people in Northern Ireland support unification. That's it, 11%. So they need to get up here and get the fiat power on GovBench for this debate to happen, and I'm perfectly willing to grant this to them, to say we're going to fundamentally shift the political calculus in Northern Ireland and get people to support this democratically. If they don't want to say that, then they need to get up here and say we're for overriding the democratic rights of people in Northern Ireland, which seems to be exactly the opposite of what they've been saying so far. If we give them that fiat power, and I'm happy to do so, that means we get symmetrical fiat power ourselves. That we get the political capital necessary to say, hey, wait a second, if you get to shift pretty much the political opinion of every person in Northern Ireland, we get to stand up and say, hey, we get to make sure a hard Brexit doesn't happen. That's what you need to do to allow this debate to occur. And that means you have to credit Xavier's analysis when he comes up here and says, we don't think a hard Brexit will happen. And we think because of that, a lot of their analysis about the economic harms of this debate completely fall off the table because they don't engage with the fact that a hard Brexit isn't the status quo or the potential status quo that we're debating. All right, I want to engage with a couple things we get out of the second speaker's speech before moving on to some substantive myself. No, thank you. Right? Okay, we get this idea that the economy is going to be screwed over because tax rates are going to be a problem in the counterfactual on our side of the House where we don't allow tax rates to be cut when we unite Ireland. Let's note the fact that the power to cut tax rates has already been devolved to the Northern Irish legislature, and they're already planning on cutting tax rates themselves. Then they also, no thank you, want to get up here and talk about common agricultural policy. Right? They want to get up here and say, because Northern Ireland will leave the EU, they're no longer going to have any access to common agricultural policy, and they're going to lose tons of money because of it. Let's note a couple things here. The first is, we don't necessarily think a hard Brexit is going to happen. So there's a situation on our side of the House where this doesn't occur and this harm doesn't accrue. But even if you don't credit that and you say we're leaving the common agricultural policy, which might be fairly likely, we have to note the fact that the United Kingdom has farmers, right? They have farmers in Northern Ireland, they have farmers in the rest of the country, right? And they understand that farmers are going to get screwed over by this common agricultural policy exit, and they have an interest in making sure that doesn't actually happen. So we think there's a strong political interest for the UK to step in and start providing some of the same subsidies that the common agricultural policy already did. All right, no thank you. Let's move on to some points of substantive. Let's talk about public spending, right? There's two potential worlds we get here. And we're going to engage charitably with their characterization of unification and say, let's get a functioning government in a united Ireland. Let's pretend that a functioning government happens. You still have major economic problems for Ireland, right? Why is this? The Northern Irish government runs a budget deficit, as Xavier talked about, of 33% of their output, right? The UK government subsidizes that government for around £10 billion a year. The public sector in Northern Ireland is responsible for around 30% of employment in Northern Ireland. What does this actually mean? This means Northern Ireland is a net tax recipient, not a taxpayer. You unite Ireland, and even if the government makes smart, unbiased decisions, which Xavier gives you reasons to think won't happen, you end up with less money to go around in both Northern Ireland and in the rest of United Ireland itself, right? Then you have two options to try to make up this shortfall. The first is that you end up cutting spending in Northern Ireland, right? You fire a bunch of people, you cut pensions and extraneous services. For instance, people in Northern Ireland don't even pay their water bills, right? You start making them pay that themselves. All right, what does this actually mean? This means a couple things. It means those 30% of people in Northern Ireland who are employed by the public sector end up getting fired and unemployed. When government wants to come up here and talk to you about unemployment is the biggest harm in this debate because it affects real people and people are going to die because of it, right? You get more unemployed people on their side of the house because all of a sudden we've had to cut spending across the board. This means a couple of things. No, thank you. Not only do people aggressively get harmed economically, you also see a propensity to increase in violence. Because as government gets up here and tells you the reason people aren't going back to violence these days is because they're employed, because they have jobs, right? And all of a sudden, you fire 30% of the people in Northern Ireland, what do you think they're going to do, right? They're pissed off, and their opportunity cost of fighting is significantly lower. We think that leads to violence, even if the vast majority of people don't turn to violence. If the top 2 to 3% of that bell curve shifts to violence, terrorist groups with 100 people, 200 people, in this day and age, can do incredible amounts of harm and harm people and also harm the economy. But you have a second option, and this is still pretending that you have a super beneficial and benevolent government in Northern Ireland. Instead of cutting spending in Northern Ireland, you can raise taxes across the board, right? This seems potentially problematic because you can't raise the corporate tax because that gets rid of every economic benefit they want to talk about. Because if you raise the corporate tax, Northern Ireland is never going to get more investment. So what does that mean? If you're going to raise taxes, you have to raise individual taxes. This disproportionately harms the people of Northern Ireland, no thank you, because the median household income in Northern Ireland is significantly lower than the median household income in the Republic of Ireland. If you raise income taxes across the board, what does that mean? You end up with people in Northern Ireland who have less money in their pockets, and because they're poor in the first place, are less likely to consume because their marginal propensity to consume is lower. That means consumer consumption drops more than proportionally in Northern Ireland. But even more importantly, besides that economic harm itself, what happens? People have less money in their pockets, and it's happened immediately post-unification. Taxes have gone up. People don't like that. They're pissed about it. And who are they going to blame? All of a sudden, you have people in the South blaming the North for being freeloaders, for taking our money, for forcing us to raise taxes, right? What does this do? Not only, again, is this more likely to lead to violence because people are unhappy that they now have less money in their pockets, and again, the opportunity cost of violence declines, but you end up with a perception in the Republic of Ireland that unification and the North are to blame. That means you get new political extremism in Dublin. You get a decrease of the ability of the government to actually adequately respond to any of the problems, no thank you, raised by unification, because people in Dublin are inclined to be far less charitable to people in Northern Ireland. But again, all of this assumes that you get a good government post-unification. Let's engage solidly with our analysis where we say you probably get a bad government in either one of two forms. The first, you get a government that is fundamentally oppressive because Northern Ireland is a minority, as they want to talk about, that no one cares about, as they want to talk about. So you get a government in Dublin who caters almost entirely to the South, or, more charitably, as Xavier tells you, in order to make this kind of thing actually happen in the first place, you get a government that fights each other, that has constant veto power to stop each other from actually doing anything. What does that mean? In either of these potential worlds, post-leaving the UK funding dries up, and all of a sudden the government in the South is either unable to reinstitute that kind of spending or unwilling to do so because they don't care or the people in Northern Ireland don't have enough political power to actually make that happen. Right? Not only does that mean all of the harms I just talked about, where people get fired or taxes get raised, not how it happens anyway, and you see more violence and economic harms because of it, it also means that spending on things like infrastructure, which Northern Ireland desperately needs, is less likely to get cleared in the legislature because that government doesn't care about or doesn't want to help Northern Ireland. Right? It also means things like healthcare spending gets slashed. It means that because of the diverse rural nature of Northern Ireland, you don't actually get the new spending on healthcare that you need. Right? And again, that hurts people directly, hurts them where it matters, their healthcare, their families, etc., and you're going to see violence because of that. On our side of the house, we give you direct economic harms, and we give you an appeal to violence that's more important than anything you get out of government. So proud to oppose.
I now call upon Grunwell for closing motion.
Ireland has changed. From coffin ship adventures to jobs in Accenture, how far our small republic has travelled in half a century defies belief. However, the North has not fared quite as well. Depending on the metric used, the value of the Republic's output per person lies somewhere between 2.5 as much as that of the North. Simultaneously, the threat once posed by radical Republicans to our state has evaporated. Today, there remains two broad factors which drive this disparity in prosperity and stability. The first being institutional arrangement, and the second being economic policy. Uniting the economic and political structures of the North and South is the only long-run strategy capable of breaking down this malaise. As Mark identified in his speech, the harms imposed by Brexit, specifically the most likely sort of Brexit that's going to occur, upon the actors most affected, the communities living along the border, are enormous. Already overlooked by whoever governs them, for this group, unity is clearly the most preferable option post-Brexit. Caoimhin provides an actually compelling characterization of the incentives in place for actors in the North regarding violence, explaining the historical uniqueness of the troubles and the violence that arose in this period, as well as analysing the interplay between violent extremism and economic outcomes. Broadly, 3 points in the speech. Firstly, the detrimental impact of the current institutional arrangement. Secondly, economic policy making broadly. The third point, violent extremism. In that order. Firstly, it's important to note that under the status quo, politics in Northern Ireland is dominated by two extremist ethnic parties. The reasons for this are threefold. Firstly, local autonomy. Only people in the North vote in the elections which send people to Stormont. The second reason is that parties representing both sectarian factions are allowed to exist. That is to say, both sides retain people either involved in violence or directly supportive of some sorts of violence when it occurred. The third reason is poor economic outcomes. That is to say, people are more likely to buy into the scapegoating of any out-group that a politician lays the blame for societal ails at the feet of when they themselves are doing financially less well. Note that this setup is entrenched by the institutional configuration which we see in the North. The impact of this is threefold. Firstly, you get political deadlock. It is very difficult to ever make decisions, ever in Stormont, as a result of the extent to which these parties are at loggerheads with each other. The second thing is that insofar as ethnic parties are allowed to exist, voters disproportionately are more likely to vote for the party which is more extreme. That is to say, they're more likely to vote for the party which is going to show a tougher stance against the other side, that is more likely to win them the conflict in Stormont with which they have been engaged for the last 50 years. No thank you. The third impact is that when sitting in Stormont, even though it exists to a comparatively less degree than previously, both parties tend to simply function tribalistically, setting atop patronage networks for their respective communities. The comparative is that policymaking on our side of the House is necessarily more rational. The localism of politics is no longer exclusively viewed through the zero-sum sectarian lens through which every political act has been viewed in the North for the last 50 years. That means that comparatively there is more scope for negotiation and compromise with, I don't know, Fianna Gael and Fianna Fáil, as opposed to the party which your community perceives to be an existential threat to their own. That means you get comparatively better policy making. The second thing I want to address is economic policy, and this leads nicely on from my last point. The first is regarding resource allocation. Equality in the North has been corrupted in the aforementioned manner, whereby investment, provision of services, and public sector jobs still, even though it is to a less degree, tend towards distribution in a tit-for-tat manner between the two communities, rather exclusively on the basis of need. Now, that exists comparatively to a lesser degree in the Republic of Ireland. Note that they say this will happen anyway. But Protestants have never been discriminated against in the Republic of Ireland. Protestants have often held high government positions for as long as the Republic has existed. Comparing the political culture of discrimination which exists in the two states is just a bizarre claim and truly betrays the ignorance of an Aussie and an American speaker in a debate of the North of Ireland. No, thank you. Now, this matter of resource allocation, combined with the economic and regulatory policy mismatch which occurs when London is broadly determining these things as opposed to the North, leads to a problem.
The problem is that, in general, the government needs to step in to provide employment. This is allowed to occur, no thank you, because of autonomous local institutions, combined with the government in Westminster that is willing and able to finance as large a budget deficit as the North requires, because that means they broadly stay less angry or whatever. But the long-run impact of this policy is the crowding out of local business by the government sector, whereby persistent government deficits cause the real interest rate to be higher than it otherwise would be, thereby reducing the capacity of private enterprise to borrow money for their own businesses. And they say that, oh, well, we don't have any money to do this in the Republic. But as identified in the previous two speakers, the EU has a direct vested incentive in financing this, funding the phasing out of this policy in the medium run, such that eventually we can wean the North off of their overt dependency on government employment. Caoimhin gives you 4 broad reasons as to why economically the North will do better in the Republic. The first being the harmonisation of tax rates and regulations, the second being diminished barriers to entry to EU markets, the third being the adoption of the euro, a comparative devaluation of currencies, which is good for exports, the fourth being the reduction in government infrastructure, reduction in government bureaucracy, which necessarily occurs when you no longer have 2 governments operating simultaneously at once. That is a comparative win. Why is this the case? It can be easy to lose track of reality in debating. Oftentimes, rhetorical flourishes and well-explained arguments function as substitutes for the truth. However, everything mentioned above and in Caoimhin's speech is basically predicted by the most rigorous econometric modelling on the ramifications of unification produced by the firm KLB currently available. In light of any empirical evidence, this is a far more preferable substitute for the truth than any rhetorical grandstanding of the opposition. Moreover, the important thing to note here is that these two factors are self-reinforcing. A dissatisfied polis continues to elect parties which blame the other group, increasingly the most extreme of these. The parties in turn have no incentive to not continue crowding out private enterprise, because doing so would reduce the power of the government within society, of which they are constitutionally mandated to be a part of on the basis of the power-sharing institutions of which they are a part. Moreover, as long as the economy isn't doing so well, people continue to buy into the same scapegoating rhetoric which has won the elections of the North for the last 50 or 60 years. The third point I want to talk about is the relationship between circumstance, violent extremism. No, thank you. Poverty leads to extremism, and this is as true in the Sahel as it is on the Falls Road. Now, both groups, like on either side of the house or whatever, feel marginalised by the state under which they live in some capacity, because they live in one of the most deprived regions within the United Kingdom, and then their elected representatives continue to blame the other side for this being the case. The policy configurations which I've described mean this continues to be the case, and people continue to remain frustrated with each other, which leads to the continued low-level violence which we see. So the impact of this is that under the status quo, there is broadly no incentive for either party to change the course of policy. The second is that Northern Ireland remains locked in a cycle of low-level civil unrest and seasonal violence, as described by Caoimhin, permanently disincentivising foreign direct investment and any sort of economic openness. The third thing is that political deadlock just ensues as a result of neither side really benefiting electorally from admitting culpability, nor stepping down from the lofty stances of adamant opposition to the other side which they have taken. Panel, ladies and gentlemen, at least in the long run, we are more likely to see a permanent end to violence and tensions sooner, through the ameliorating effects which prosperity and stability tend to have upon both radical ideologies and post-conflict societies. We ought to accept that this is a necessary trade-off to break up the political sclerosis of the region and secure a future of abundance for its people. We ought to unite Ireland not to impose Rome rule upon the North, but to deliver her people the security and plenty that we alone have enjoyed in this island for far too long. So proud to propose.
Well, it's been about an hour, and now you get to hear from someone who isn't a man. It's a wild time.
kind of ironic that an Australian and an American gave you the best and most plausible analysis as to what is actually going to happen on the Northern Irish border. But we'll get to that a little bit later. I'm going to do a handful of things for you in this speech. I'm going to go through all of the things that we've heard out of side government, and I'm going to explain to you why either they are just like factually inaccurate, or why they are implausible, or why the impacts that they claim will not accrue and occur in a far more meaningful sense on our side of the House. Then I'm going to provide you with the metric by which I believe that you should judge this debate, and why I believe that what we have provided to you on side opposition is fundamentally the best possible outcome for the citizens of Northern Ireland, that I think the majority of the people in this room would agree are the most important people that we're talking about within the context of this debate. And finally, I'm going to go through why it is that, actually what is going to happen is that, on-side government, what will accrue is both a political and an economic travesty, and why we cannot support that on-side opposition. I'd also like to thank Oxford University for negating any ability they have to call us all the Brits, given that I'm the only Brit on the team. So let's go through what we heard out of side government. So Justin points this out, when Mark gets up and says that, we should value most of all what it is that the people of Northern Ireland want. Before you explain the economic detriments that reunifying Ireland would have on Northern Ireland, about 34% of Northern Irish citizens say that they're in favour of it. At the point where you explain that this would not only lead to a massive economic deficit, increasing what they already have, but also placing a massive amount of strain on the Republic of Ireland, only 11% of Northern Irish citizens say that they would be in favour of reunification. No. Two things accrue from that. One, at their best case scenario, they do not have majority support for this policy. But two, at worst case, only just over 1 in 10 Northern Irish individuals would value this. If Mark wants to set up that they care about respecting the will of Northern Irish people, side government have to lose this debate. I think that the other thing to note here is that a lot of their analysis is hinged on the lack of likelihood for a soft deal Brexit. We've explained this to you throughout side opposition, right? Two things. One, it is highly likely that the United Kingdom is going to remain within the customs union. This is not just us asserting that Theresa May has said a thing. This is ongoing negotiations with Brussels that the EU is happy to agree with, happy to support, provided we make some other concessions when we leave the European Union, right? All of the empirical truths that Ryan wants to get up and talk to you about are not backed up by any evidence for change to Northern Ireland post the soft Brexit that we have proven to you is highly likely to happen. Let's talk about what Caoimhin says, because I think this is probably the most important and impactful stuff that comes out of side government, right? Two things. He wants to tell you that there is an easy way out on their side, insofar as the EU will just provide all this magical money from their magical money tree. 3 points of response. Number one, insofar as Mark points out that Northern Ireland has a relatively small population, I do not see why the EU would vastly increase the amount that they give to the island of Ireland to top up the £10 billion that the UK has been able to provide them. No. Second point of response. I think it is worth noting, firstly, that EU member states have become increasingly introspective in the last couple of years. The rise of populism within their own states has meant that they care far more about themselves than about the arbitrary notion of uniting some island that they're probably not going to have a massive amount of trade with on the other side of the UK, right? This is not something that is going to be massively impactful to say, I don't know, Sweden, I guess. Second point on this, I think it is also worth pointing out a fundamental misunderstanding that's come out of side government. The EU historically devolves the vast majority of internal spending to its member states, which is the reason why the United Kingdom has been historically doing this rather than it being centralised funding coming from the European Union. Therefore, I do not think it is legitimate for side government to get up and just say, we're going to completely restructure the EU. I don't think that they have proven that that is possible. No. What does Ryan say? Ryan talks a little bit about crowding out. So I think that this happens far more on side government. The reason for this is the reason I've already outlined. You have far thinner spreading of government funding and therefore a worse economic situation, as Justin tells you and gets absolutely no response, both in the Republic and in Northern Ireland. You get a far worse economic situation for both of them. No one on side government has proven to you that that will not be the case. The second thing I would point out here is that Northern Ireland has the unique opportunity to access the United Kingdom whilst being a part of it, right? The UK is still the 6th biggest global economy, right? This is something that is cutting off the arms of the Northern Irish economy and then expecting them to get into a fist fight. This is not something that is viable under any circumstances. I think that an incompetent government, which is what will happen under side government, will provide all of the harms that Ryan talks about and will happen in a far worse way. So what is actually happening, right? I'm going to give you a couple of pieces of framing. But first of all, like a little bit of an analogy that Xavier touches on, right? Firemen are there to put out fires, right? So asking whether your house is on fire 20 years after the firemen have come and put out the fire doesn't seem particularly productive to me. Getting rid of the fire brigade, I think, leads to two things. One, nobody is going to be there to put out the fires when they happen. Two, arsonists are going to be aware that nobody will be there to put out the fires. Therefore, they're more likely to start fires. Just think about it. A little bit of framing for you as to how it is I think you should judge this debate. I think it is worth pointing out that this is something that is still very visceral in living memory. Throughout the 1990s, death and destruction were headlines on a daily basis as a result of the Troubles. Like the Good Friday Agreement is younger than I am, and I'm not that old, right? We think that this is something that is still prominent ideologically, economically, and religiously in the minds of people on either side of the Irish border. Note that therefore a new generation, is growing up in the aftermath of this, and therefore a generation who lived through the Troubles is going to be still very much politically active, and therefore more likely to have visceral dichotomized memories and opinions of what happened to them during this period of civil unrest. We think that this leads to two things. One, it leads to the provision of antagonistic and dichotomized viewpoints, where you are more likely to blame the other side of the coin for any troubles that accrue to you, whether those are political, whether those are social, whether those are economic. We think that on their side of the house, at the point where reunification happens, it provides you with a far clearer direct mandate to blame the other side for any of the problems that have accrued to you, whether that's like a bigger inclusion of like differing religious backgrounds in like socio-political spheres, whether that is the fact that your economy is going down the fucking toilet, which is honestly what's going to happen. Mark.
The trade-off in terms of what will happen for North economically is very simple. On the one hand, the UK will not be able to provide the same level of funding it currently does, and the EU will be providing nothing, because the EU is not going to give to Britain after it leaves the EU if they're not paying it. Conversely, that Northern Ireland can stay in the EU and get money, and they can get money from the Republic.
Okay, but that just isn't going to happen because they're not going to get the same level of money that we can provide to them in the United Kingdom. I know I'm a woman, but you could at least listen. How to judge this debate, panel? You have to judge this debate based on how people provide the best possible outcomes for Northern Irish citizens. On our side of the house, not only is Northern Ireland a net tax recipient, giving them the decreased opportunity cost of pushing back against the United Kingdom when people have jobs, money, engagement, safety, all of the nice things that we value in our day-to-day lives that are going to decrease exponentially on their side of the house, as my teammates have outlined to you. But B, at the point where 15% of the MI5 budget goes to Northern Ireland in terms of ensuring ongoing safety, we provide a far clearer mechanism for how you decrease the probability of violence. Why is violence going to happen on their side of the house? And note that, like, even if what I'm about to say isn't true, the perception that violence may occur leads to exactly the same harms. So it is completely irrelevant for Keelan to get up and be like, violence isn't going to happen, because people are nevertheless going to think that it might. Three things. One, there's going to be a lot more sympathy for people who then propagate violence, right? Because every failure of a new state is going to be attributed to unification. Every attack is going to provide political capital for reprisals by nationalists. Reason number two, you're going to have like decreased British funding, decrease in like the 15% of the MI5 budget that provides and ensures ongoing safety in Northern Ireland, and a lack of ongoing infrastructure. Reason number three, you're not going to need that much to cause serious terrorist harm, as Justin points out, and doesn't get a response. It's just a 1 or 2% of the top of the bell curve that is necessary to propagate deep-seated religious intolerance and deep-seated mistrust within the island of Ireland in a way that is not going to be productive. At the end of the day, panel, not only are there massively dichotomized identities on both sides of the border, but not even the notion of true violence, but rather the perception of division is more than enough to ensure all of this actually happens. Also, all of the economic stuff that Justin talked about that I don't understand because I do classics. But at the end of the day, this provides a far better situation, both economically and politically, for the citizens of Northern Ireland. We beg you to oppose. Oh, yeah. There isn't really room. I'd better have got a nice rifle. It's the only reason I came.
And I welcome Jim Murphy to the floor to propose the motion.
Thanks very much. Right, the first thing I'd like to open with is I think there's been a lot of talk about the border, and I think there's been a lot of talk about the issues that Northern Ireland will face. But I mean, we also need to talk about what the situation is now in Northern Ireland. And the reality is now is that there is no border. It's frictionless, right? So on a certain level, they're under different political jurisdictions, but in a certain level, like Ireland is already united. With Brexit, this can't continue. Because as it's been said time and time again, the UK can't cherry pick. And Brexit means Brexit, as it's been said. The UK has also said that it's leaving, and therefore it cannot stay in the customs union, and therefore it cannot stay in the single market. The question remains is that given the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement, there is no border. And so the fundamental problem is that how does one leave the customs union and the single market without putting in a border? And I think opposition haven't told us like what's going to happen. Brexit can't happen without there being a border. And yet, yes, there's been talk about, you know, a common regulatory area, but the UK has said no border in the sea. So what do? There is simply no viable solution. Yes.
So historically, the South's been given up to like 4 opportunities to reclaim the North they haven't taken because it's a massive economic drain. Why should they do that now when the economy is going to an even worse place than it's ever been before?
I think the Republic didn't take back the North for certain reasons, but I don't think they're to do with the economy. I think they're to do with social stability, because I think, you know, the Troubles, the period in Northern Irish history which truly scarred, I think, both the people and Northern Ireland as a place itself, just showed that, you know, it wasn't the time for unification. And I mean, it's changing now. I mean, we have to look at the demographic. Indeed, the gap is getting smaller. There's even some statistics that say that by 2021, there'll be a Catholic majority. But there are so many reasons that we could implement like a united Ireland, not only because it's the only viable solution to Brexit, given that we have to implement a border, and that would throw Northern Ireland into complete chaos. I mean, you have to think about the social, the political, the economic turmoil that would happen, you know, should Brexit leave, should the UK leave the European Union, and indeed, it's been mentioned, it will no longer have access to EU funding. But indeed, one has to also realise that the Republic and the North are at a stage where they are so deeply integrated. I mean, people trade, people travel, people work freely from in between the two states. So, you know, one has to think, what's going to happen to these people? What's going to happen to these communities? And I think, you know, a united Ireland would solve all these problems. And one must also think about, you know, the opportunities that a united Ireland could bring to Northern. Like, I mean, it's been highlighted in terms of foreign direct investment. I mean, one has to remind oneself that, you know, thanks to foreign direct investment and an economic term that was coined by the Nobel Prize laureate Paul Krugman, leprechaun economics. I mean, in 2015, Ireland had a growth rate of 25%, thanks to foreign investment. I mean, and we don't have this currently in the North because it's under a different economic policy that's currently failing, but which wouldn't fail under jurisdiction of united Ireland. So 25%, could you imagine what would happen to the North should the North have access to such economic prosperity? So a united Ireland opens the door to so many opportunities. Yes?
So we give you a number of reasons why that economic prosperity wouldn't be spread to Northern Ireland.
So Yes, so growth, employment, social cohesion, stability, and not only that, but it's also been mentioned that, you know, the division, the DUP and Sinn Féin, two opposing sides, you know, they would be included in the parliament, but there's so many parties that there wouldn't be such a divisive political system. So I beg you to support this motion.
I now call upon the floor Sophie Furlong-High to oppose the motion.
Sorry, it's dropped. There. Excellent. All of England's life, they've used Ireland as nothing more than a depository. All of England's life, they've used Ireland as nothing more than somewhere they can offload their problems onto, nothing more than a tool for their own bad actions. There's like too many examples of this to discuss, but I think chief among them is when England used us as like production for food, for the meals of slave labor. They're offloading responsibility. They have done it all of their life, and I don't think it's okay. I don't think it's fair. Generations have passed since the British colonized us. The North is not a prize which is owed to the South. Half of Northern Ireland do not want this. I think the prop on numerous occasions say that, or at least Caoimhin told me that he was going to say that all they care about is economics, but they can have both identity and economics. No, like, look, it's a floor speech. Like, you guys can all calm down, to be honest. Like, you two. Look, this is nothing but another opportunity for England to export their problems onto an unwilling republic. And look, it is an unwilling South. I think that this really wasn't something that was discussed within the debate, but there's just no way that a united Ireland would be beneficial in the North at the point in which the South do, as they have historically done, tossed the North to the side. Leo Varadkar does not want a united Ireland. Fine Gael don't want a united Ireland. They can barely afford to foot the bill. The important thing here, though, is that we can afford to foot the bill, but only barely, and only at the expense of other things. And at the point in which they see Northern Ireland as nothing but an expense, you know that they're going to give as little money as possible to this. What this looks like is a lack of infrastructure when Northern Ireland needed. What it looks like is not solving the crises that we can barely solve here. And look, so many Southerners and so much of the South, both politically and on a level which is, I guess, personal to some bad people, are like heavily resentful of Northern Ireland. And the ones who aren't are perfectly willing to tweet like, yup, take back the 800 years, in a way that is honestly incredibly disrespectful to any unionist in Northern Ireland. But the important thing is that when they tweet that for their like 4 likes or whatever, they do nothing after it because they don't give a shit. They don't care about anything but like, they don't care about anything but what, I don't know, like their parents told them to, or whatever they have inherited there. At best, the South used the North as a political tool. At worst, it is a burden upon its shoulders.
Before you go on.
No. When Brexit passes, Northern Ireland becomes a terrible logistical problem for the UK. Perhaps characterisation of the economic issues are fair, and it will be difficult for the UK to prop them up, but it will be less difficult because the UK lacks the begrudgery and the resentment which I talk about, which is I think uniquely kind of occurs in the South. Look, the point of my hastily thrown together case is that the British must reap what they have sown. They can't decide to throw it back to us when it gets too difficult. They know how bad this would be for the South.
They know how bad it would be for the North. Do not let them away with this and move to oppose.
If there's one thing I've learned about the economy over the past 10 years, is that nobody has a fucking clue what's going on. Economists don't know what's going on. These fine people certainly don't know what's going on, and I'm not even going to try. Instead, let me look to the past as I've watched reeling in the years, so I feel entitled to it. At the beginning of the 20th century, Northern Ireland was acres and bounds ahead of the South. While they were building the finest and most unlucky ships in the world, we were just happy making rosary beads out of potatoes. Then, when we asked for independence, the Red Hand of Ulster wanted no part in it. The Unionists made the ridiculous claim that a republic full of Catholics would become a socially repressive state, where all women were second-class citizens with the exceptions of the Virgin Mary and Dana. And you gotta hand it to the Unionists, I'm not their biggest fan, but they really saw that coming. But on the economic side of things, we were actually doing okay. After a trade war, a wee emergency, and a great Taoiseach with a terrible moustache, the Republic was better off than Northern Ireland economically by the 1960s. And this trend has continued to this day. We have a situation where the GDP per capita of the South is over double that of the North. Now, I have no idea what GDP per capita means, but as always, being high is a good thing. Now, I hear you say, Harry, what a stupid argument. Obviously, the Republic is richer than the North on account of all the bombing and stuff that happened up there. Well, you're wrong. Northern Ireland is about as poor as Wales or any peripheral region of the UK. Westminster really only works for London, and all the peripheral regions like Northern Ireland are left with no jobs and only stay on some sort of weird Stockholm syndrome and being bribed with the NHS. If you want proof that England doesn't care about Northern Ireland, you need only look at the way they're handling Brexit. And while Ryan Tubridy may not have Graham Norton's beard, now, and MI6 may be cooler than the Gardaí, under a united Ireland, the North would go from being a peripheral region to a big fish in a small pond. In contrast to Margaret Thatcher, who was barely bothered or even knew about the North, we would definitely pay attention to the North because, well, they're really scary. Being a big fish in a small pond is happiness. And if you don't believe me, in secondary school, I was the head of everything except the hurling team. I was beloved by all, feared by many, and the undisputed king of thirds. Then I left my pond and came here, and the only two societies that will have me now are Fianna Fáil and the Phil, so I'm not exactly hot right now. So, finish up. Northern Ireland, don't be like me. Be a big fish and come home. Thank you.
Finally, I call upon the Court of Sovereign to oppose the motion.
Okay, these are gonna come in later, okay? Let me just get some time. Okay, and in case anybody's wondering why the reason why this is in such big font is because about a month ago I sat on my glasses, and then when I went to Specsavers, the man told me that they were broken beyond repair, and I refused to buy a new one. So basically, I'm just going to read things in really big font from now on. Okay, let's go. That wasn't part of the speech, so sorry. Okay, so when I was asked to do this floor speech a few days ago by MJ Gillett over there, I was initially hesitant. I was hesitant to speak on opposition because I just couldn't really think of any arguments. But I did a lot of thinking. Okay, I scrolled on Wikipedia for a very long time. I sat like this for a very long time. And you know what? Sure enough, the arguments did come to me. And I can assure to you today that I'm going to bring some really good arguments. They're going to change the whole debate. I know the judges are gone, but I'm going to win. Okay? They're really, really good arguments. Okay, but anyway, before I get to all of those debate-winning points, I'm going to talk about, I don't know, the debate that's happened so far. I guess, so we have Oxford here. Hello. I guess, to be clear, I got rejected from Oxford two years ago, so I'm a little bit bitter. But that's not even my main memory or association with Oxford. So 3 years ago, in 2015, I went to the Oxford Open Day, and it was one of the worst trips of my life because it was 38 degrees for the entire weekend, and I fainted in a Nando's bathroom. So those are my memories. But then also I met some guy off University Challenge, and I was really starstruck. But he was very angry that I pointed out that he was from University Challenge, and he wouldn't let me ask any questions about University Challenge. So never meet your idols, I suppose. But then the joke's on him because he was wearing his jumper inside out. So I think we know. So he looked like a goddamn fool. So I think we know who the winner was in that situation. So now on to my debate-winning points. Actually, well, a little bit before my debate-winning points, I'm going to provide some solid statistical evidence to support the opposition and to back up all the arguments I'm going to have a little bit later. So I crunched the numbers, I did the maths, I really was working very hard on this. And now forgive me, it's been a while since I've, busted out the art materials. As you can tell, this is my junior cert art practical. It was actually really good. It's a bell pepper, and I did well on that. Anyway, aside from all of that, so we're gonna talk about these graphs. Which one is which? Hang on one sec. I'm going to put this there. So this is a graph of the happiness of Ireland with reunification, okay? I'd like to point out that you can see that it goes from quite a fair bit, actually, all the way down to barely any at all, okay? It goes all the way from up there, all the way to a frowny face, okay? Yes, Sophie? I'm so glad you asked her, I don't know. Spike in the graph there, that's a statistical outlier. All good statistical studies all have a statistical outlier. Okay? That's how you know it's real. It's very real. Okay? So I'd like you to keep that graph in your mind for 1 second. So now moving on to my next piece of statistical contextualization, as I like to call it. So if you look, this is the graph of happiness without reunification. So we have it going up all the way to a laughing, crying, and 100 emoji. I think that the visuals speak for themselves, okay, everyone? Oh, okay. Oh, no, you're out of time. You're actually out of time. It's fine. It's fine. You're out of time. So essentially, I'm on 3 minutes and 41 seconds, and that's actually really unfortunate because it doesn't look like I'm going to have any time to make any of this to any real sort of arguments or to explain them at all in any way. I guess I won't get to my debate-winning points after all. To be quite honest, I'm really upset about this. But rules are rules. There goes the ding-ding. Rules are rules. So, I'm so sorry.
I will now put the question to the House. On the motion that this House will deny Ireland post-Brexit, all those in favour say aye. Aye. No one told me about this. I actually stood in at the last moment for Owen O'Brien, who, for our Oxford colleagues, is a Sinn Féin TD. Owen and I are not fungible. Okay, so I'm just going to keep these remarks very brief. We're going to adjourn upstairs to actually get the awards announcement, the adjudicator's decision. And I'm not going to stand between you and a drink. Those speeches were excellent. I think you liked the last two. Well done. I'm myopic and I couldn't read those axes. So the TSN economics and math students, we could have called them out. But anyway, I enjoyed the debate this evening, and I'll keep my views to myself largely. I do think one thing that was running through it, though, was this constant focus on Northern Ireland. And there's an assumption to some extent that the economics aside that the Republic, the people of the Republic really wanted unification. You're all younger than I am, but for people over 35, they see Northern Ireland, a lot of them, as a place apart. They're more familiar with London than Belfast. In their childhoods, the only time they heard Northern accents was on RTE when someone had been brutally murdered. And so, frankly, as I have a Pavlovian response, unfortunately, and apologies to those of you with Northern accents, like those offers me, and they're very pleasant, a cup of tea, and I just kind of go into like they're menacing me. And also, I think the people. I think older people in Ireland may not actually be as keen because culturally there are differences. People in the Republic have moved on. No one mentions marriage equality, abortion, those sorts of things. It is quite a separate entity that will be difficult to assimilate. But anyway, I'd like to thank the speakers. All of them, I enjoyed it very much. I might come again. And I am no Owen O'Brien, but I'm more neutral on the topic, so I hope I could give you a there. Thank you.